everybody. We are going to start in just about a minute. We're waiting for people to come into the Zoom account. So we'll start at about 10:02 or 10:03. So good morning. Just to let everyone know, we're letting people come into the Zoom session. It takes a minute or two once we open it up. So we'll start in a minute or two. Okay, so good morning, everyone. We're going to start, and there'll still be people coming into the call. It takes a minute or two to get everybody in. So we'll start now. So I want to welcome everybody. In case people don't know who I am, I'm Liz Hume. I'm the acting president and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. The Alliance for Peacebuilding is a membership-based organization. We have over 150 organizations working in peacebuilding. And if you are interested in becoming a member, your organization becoming a member, please reach out to us. One of the things that we have really started talking about is the power of a network. And our field has grown considerably in the last decade and even in the last few years. But the way to do that is through the power of a network and working together collaboratively. So we do encourage you to reach out to us, even just to get involved in any of our events like this. But we welcome participation from everybody. So please let us know. But this session today on climate change, ecological threats, and conflict is a really critical discussion. And we have an incredible session today. I will be turning it over to Cynthia Brady, but I just wanted to outline a little bit of what we're talking about. And especially within the US, in the last 4 years or so, there hasn't been a lot of work in this sector. And in this last year, we've seen an incredible amount of work on climate change. But at the same time, one of our concerns is to make sure that conflict prevention and peace building is integrated into the sector. So many of you will hear me say this a lot. The world, we're experiencing a 30-year high in violent conflict. We have a global violent conflict problem that knows no boundaries. And there are many things that are compounding that issue. Climate change is a compounding factor to conflict drivers. And that's really what we want to talk about today. We want to make sure that we understand the issues on both sides from climate change and conflict, and also discuss what has to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about Cynthia Brady. She's been a colleague and a close friend for almost 2 decades. We worked very closely at USAID together. She is an expert of experts on these issues. She's always one of my go-to people on these issues. She worked at USAID for many, many years. She is now at the Wilson Center. And she is just, again, I'll just say it again, she is an expert on these issues and has been working so hard for her entire career, going on almost 2 decades, on climate change and conflict, and has been one of the leading drivers on this, and really one of the early experts. So it is always such a privilege to have her here, and to continue to be able to work with her. I also just want to point out, AFP recently put out a policy on integrating conflict and climate change, and we'll put it in the chat, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It really outlines the issue And we're grateful. We've worked very closely with Interaction, the Wilson Center, Cynthia Brady, and USIP. So I think it is a really good document, a great baseline document to go to. But there's other incredible work that's being done, and a lot of our panelists today will talk that through. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia and thank everybody for coming today.
Thank you so much, Liz, for kicking it off and for that very warm introduction. I will admit that when I showed up at AID a very long time ago and started talking about things like the connection between climate change and conflict, Liz was on board, and she was always supportively asking lots of questions in her own portfolio about these issues. So Liz, thank you for your longstanding interest and support for those of us who have been working on natural resources, climate, and the connections to violence and conflict for a long time. You continue to be a great ally and advocate, and putting together events like today to bring in even more audiences and voices is really appreciated, I know, by everyone on the panel today. So thank you to Liz and to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for putting this event together this morning and asking me to be a part of it. As Liz shared briefly in her opening remarks, we're going to focus today on how to build better bridges between the realms of climate, environment, and peace building, as well as conflict prevention. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of compound risks, as she mentioned. That is a concept that stresses and threats to a system's stability are not just additive or layered, they're actually interactive. Inputs respond to and influence one another. And this idea is really exemplified by the approach taken in the new Ecological Threats Register, which our panel is going to discuss today, and which Michael will present. The ETR compares ecological threat data with peace and fragility data at the country level to explore the compound risks formed between them. The upshot is that the world's least resilient countries, when faced with ecological stress, are more likely to experience civil unrest, political instability, social fragmentation, and economic collapse. At the same time, one of the attributes of the ETR that I really appreciate personally is its focus on positive peace and resilience. When we think about the compound risks of, for example, climate-driven water scarcity or extreme weather events, hitting a place like the Northern Triangle of Central America, where food insecurity is already high, forced displacement is high, and criminality and organized crime are rampant, we can easily see how weak governing institutions will be overwhelmed and the people affected are going to suffer. But I think we can also see that if there is strong social cohesion, livelihood diversity, and trusted institutions for things like disaster early warning, well, the inputs wouldn't cause the same level of disruption and pain to the people in those places. So what we know from real world lessons learned is that these are not separate issues. Our panelists today have a lot of experience with this complexity. And what I think they're going to tell us is that while communities and even entire countries can be affected simultaneously by challenges like climate change, conflict, and as we are all very well today, pandemics, those vulnerabilities are clearly mutually reinforcing. But some of the solutions are mutually reinforcing too. So we're going to spend some of the time over the next hour mining all of our panelists' knowledge and experience to explore the opportunities and the barriers to peace and conflict-focused communities of practice, better understanding the relevance of climate and environmental issues and figuring out how to address them, as well as how more environmental-focused actors can really better internalize the importance and necessity of conflict sensitivity and even conflict prevention work in their own portfolios. We would like to discuss a bit how to bridge global action and strategy with local work so that hopefully everyone participating in this meeting today can feel connected to the shared project of solution seeking. And our last reminder behind the scenes before we started today, Liz's recommendation was that she really wanted us to talk about solutions. So we're going to focus on that part for sure. And on that note, I wanted to try to reserve some time at the end of the discussion for a question and answer period, but I'd really like to integrate all of your perspectives as the audience throughout the conversation, not just wait until the end. So please do feel free to send your comments and questions along in the chat while the rest of us are talking. And the Alliance for Peacebuilding team and I will do our best to pick up as many of those thoughts and comments as we can along the way to try to make this as participatory of a discussion as possible, even though it's virtual. So now we're going to get right to it, and I will introduce our speakers, starting with Michael Collins. Michael is the Executive Director for the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Michael develops working partnerships with Americas-based governments, civil society organizations, foundations, universities, businesses, and think tanks, and seeks new opportunities to build IEP's presence and impact throughout the Americas, with a particular focus on expanding the use of IEP's positive peace framework as a training tool and an evidence-based metric for peace-centered development. Before joining IEP, Michael oversaw educational, job creation, and economic development programs in emerging nations recovering from natural disasters, working frequently with communities who were affected by poverty and gang violence. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Francine Madden. Francine is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding, where she leads CPeace's conservation conflict transformation capacity building, strategic guidance, and conflict assessment and intervention work. For over 20 years, Francine has successfully intervened in controversial fish and wildlife conflicts using these issues as entry points to target the deeper-rooted systemic conflicts that underpin natural resource challenges. Francine holds an impressive 2 master's degrees from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and she is the author of an incredible number of publications on various aspects of human-wildlife conflict, conservation conflict, and social conflict within wildlife conservation. And for those of us based in Washington, D.C., she may be very familiar to you because she was profiled in the Washington Post. And third, we have also a longstanding colleague and friend, John Furlow. John is the director of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. He joined IRI in 2017 as its deputy director for humanitarian assistance and international development, and he became its director in May of 2021. Congratulations, John. Prior to coming to IRI, John designed and led the Climate Change Adaptation Program in USAID's Climate Change Office. As an example of the work he did in that role, he advised the government of Jamaica in the development of its national climate change policy and its climate smart agriculture sector plan. And he also led a project to develop Jamaica's agroclimate service, which produces a seasonal forecast tailored for farmers and disseminated by text to agricultural extension workers. John has also worked at the US Department of State, where he designed and managed the National Adaptation Plan Global Network as part of US preparations for the Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Paris. So we are very grateful to have all 3 of you here today, and you each come from slightly different organizational perspectives and field experience. So I think we're going to have a pretty lively conversation that brings all of your experiences together. We are going to start with my first question to Michael. So Michael, with the release of the second version of the Ecological Threat Register in recent days, what are the main takeaways? What are the current trends we're seeing in terms of the evolution of ecological threats and communities' ability to respond to them? Over to you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for kind of sort of providing outline, prior of the Ecological Threat Register and essentially what it tries to do or how it sort of compares these levels of exposure to ecological threats with this underlying sort of level of social resilience, right, which we measure through the Positive Peace Index. I mean, the whole sort of aim of this essentially is to really determine that the most, the countries that are most likely or most rapidly likely to fall into conflict due to ecological degradation. So there are kind of sort of 5 key ecological threat indicators that we track in that, and that relates to food security or food risk, water risk, population growth, natural disasters, and also temperature anomalies or spikes. In terms of sort of the main findings, I suppose that the first one is kind of, helps reinforce the points that Liz was making in her initial comments, and that is kind of the intimate connection and sort of cyclicality that exists, right, between these ecological threats and levels of violence around the world. So just taking some sort of top level findings from the Ecological Threat Report, 11 of the 15 countries with the worst ecological threat score in the report are countries that are in conflict. And the other 4 of those are countries that are at risk of substantially at risk of falls in peace in the near future. 28 of the 30 countries with the worst ETR score are in the bottom half of the global peace index. And sort of on the flip side of that, or on the sort of the top side, I suppose you could say, no country that has a high level of peace has an extremely poor ETR score. So that not only sort of speaks to the actual correlation, but also to the cyclicality and the reinforcing nature of these two things that compound on each other, as Liz said. Especially if we take into consideration the gaps in, also the increasing gap in peacefulness between low and high peace countries. And, this can function positively in the case of high peace countries, but it can also create these negative feedback loops, right? So we all kind of sort of understand how conflict can create things, can lead to confinement or displacement of communities. It can disrupt patterns of trade. It can lead to the abandonment of agricultural land and the destruction of assets and the loss of life. And all of these things then contribute to higher levels of ecological threat, which weaken institutions, which then lead to increased conflict. The second main large finding from the ecological threat register is sort of purely the increasing reach and intensity of these ecological threats around the world. So, for example, with regards to food insecurity, that's something that's been rising since 2015. And that's a reversal of a long-term trend in which food security had been improving. Now, we project that there's going to be a 45% increase in the number of undernourished people by 2050, so over a billion people. Now, that's undernourished in the sense that that's people who are physically affected by lack of food. If we look at it in terms of food insecurity, which is a slightly broader definition, I suppose you could say, related to people's access to food within a certain time during the year, is actually 3 to 4 times higher than that. Now, global demand for food overall is going to increase by 50% by the same time, by 2050. A lot of that is going to be driven by population growth. The speed of population growth has declined since the 60s, but it's still high in many parts of the world. There are 11 countries that are projected to double their population by 2050. All of these in sub-Saharan Africa. These are countries that have a high number of ecological threats. In other words, they're already suffering from increased water stress, increased food security, natural disasters, temperature volatility as well as having high levels of conflict. So by 2050, nearly 50% of the population worldwide will reside in countries with high and extremely high ecological threats. And more than half of the population is going to live in the 40 least peaceful countries. So let me just go ahead and share very quickly a map here. Bear with me just a sec. Excellent, great. So I'm assuming that you see this, and I just wanted to highlight this. This is kind of, I suppose you could say, a main summary of the ecological threat register. And the first thing I'd like to note very quickly is perhaps the level of granularity. Those who may have be familiar with the report last year is on country per country basis. This year it covers more countries, 178, and we've actually been able to break findings down by administrative unit as well. So over 2,500 administrative units. So North America and Europe, these areas here are the ones with the lowest average level of ecological threats. That's followed by Latin America and the Caribbean. And on the flip side of that, the areas with the highest exposure to ecological threats, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa here, followed by the MENA region. Afghanistan is the country most exposed to ecological threats. All 34 of its administrative units actually have exposure to high levels of ecological threats. And 87% of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, all of these countries that you see down here on the bottom, are facing extremely high levels of threat. Now, until now, I've been talking mainly of exposure, and countries' ability to be able to deal with this exposure is going to differ significantly, and that will be based largely on their underlying level of resilience, right, and social resilience and social cohesion in many ways. So this is where we bring to bear, the positive peace component of the work that we do to compare that underlying vulnerability to this exposure. And this has allowed us to be able to kind of identify what we consider to be 30 hotspot countries. These are countries that have very low levels of resilience. They have increasing ecological threats, and many of which are already in conflict as well. These hotspots are currently home to over a billion people, 1.26 billion people, and 18 of these 30 hotspots are in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the region that has the lowest resilience worldwide. And, in terms of what we can expect to see, well, increased conflict, failed states, and increased displacement over the next 30 years. Now, displacement is at an all-time high right now, and out of the 34 million people that were displaced from their home nation, so this is not taking into account internally displaced people, 68% of those came from these hotspot countries that we're talking about here. Now, I'd like to just share one more thing. Oh, and actually, I just wanted to provide a quick readout of the countries here. Of course, you can go to the Ecological Threat Register and you can look at all of this in a lot more detail. But one of the things that I wanted to bring in at the tail end of this, and this is to bring climate change back in, and a lot of the ecological threats that we talked about, they're certainly aggravated by climate change, but they are independent from it. So this is why the ETIS focuses on ecological threats rather than climate change exclusively. But nonetheless, as both Cynthia and Liz mentioned, it's a significant aggravator. So we had the opportunity to be able to analyze data in partnership with Lloyd's Register Foundation as part of their World Risk poll. And this relates to perception of climate change, namely whether you think that climate change is going to be is of serious concern over the next is a serious risk over the next 20 years. This covered 148 countries and about 150,000 people. So overall, the news is relatively good in the sense that 48% of the 142 countries covered had more than 50% of the people that perceive climate change as a very serious threat in the next 20 years. But at the same time, some of the most significant emitters of carbon dioxide are countries where their citizens are least concerned about climate change. So for example, none of the four greatest emitters, right, China, the US, India, and Russia, had more than 50% of people who are concerned about climate change in this way. China in particular had very low levels of concern at 23%. And that applies too for the largest emitters per capita that also had low levels of concern, mainly countries in the Middle East, such as Oman and Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, etc. There are sort of three countries that span both of those in terms of overall emissions, but also per capita emissions, and that's Canada, the US, and Australia. And that's 56, 49 in the case of the US, and 52 respectively. Just to add, there's a number of countries there that show very low level of concerns. There are also countries that are, in conflict or immediately post-conflict. So, somewhat, it's understandable that climate change is not necessarily on people's mind there. And the last thing to note is that South and Central America are the regions showing the highest concern, as you can see here. I should note also that this also extends to Spanish-speaking countries, including Spain and Portugal. So there could be a cultural element there could be a language element as well. So I wanted to bring this in because, before we were talking about what needs to be done at a country level, but this is obviously related to global governance. I'm going to leave it there. Very happy. This is all very depressing, so very eager to jump into the solutions component, which I think we're going to be talking about next.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, it's always good to start out with the problems so we get properly motivated to focus on the solution finding. Thank you for sharing that. I think the ETR does a real service to the field by bringing all of these different factors together in a way that we can visualize in a more comprehensive way, and talking about the specific risks that you see overlaid and how the people in the countries affected by these things perceive those risks is going to be an important part, I think, of our next part of our conversation about how do you intervene in ways that actually support the priorities and needs of affected populations rather than diagnosing the problem from where we sit and coming up with a solution from where we sit. I am going to next turn the conversation towards Francine, who has spent a lot of time working at the local level. And I wanted to tie in a great question that came up from Courtney Cole during Michael's presentation, because I think this is a lot of what Francine has experience with, which is, so Courtney's question was, so how do you look at this big comprehensive type of data and apply it, make it make sense on the ground, especially where both threats from either the conflict and peacebuilding side of the equation or from the ecological climate side of the equation may not be equally relevant in the near term. So if the threat of violence is not immediately on the horizon, how do you make it relevant to people who are worried about a conservation agenda today? That sort of question. So while the ETR gives us a really comprehensive picture of the world, Francine, I would turn this to you. Sorry about my frog in my throat. Nevertheless, despite those data points that Michael presented, the peacebuilding community tends to still view climate change and ecological threats as forces that just exacerbate the problems they were already dealing with. And similarly, conservation communities can sometimes fail to understand that conflict sensitivity isn't just an add-on. It's really fundamental to the success of their core conservation goals. So that sometimes leaves us in a place where different communities of practice are not taking a fully systems perspective. And you've had some experience with that. I wonder if you can share more with us about your experience with how that type of divide forms and maybe how it manifests when you're working with these different communities of practice, because you're working across this divide. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks to the Alliance for Peacebuilding and Cynthia and my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here. So I will start by saying that I think conflict sensitivity is a necessary but insufficient capacity for people working in this space. I think it's really critical that people have the capacity to transform that conflict, because whether you're coming from more of the peacebuilding side or the ecological threat side, as Cynthia said, this really is a system-wide problem, and we need to take a more holistic look at it. And it's not just the do no harm is critical, the adding value is critical, but really being able to transform the conflict is both what's needed and it's what can be done. And we see in our community of practice of people who are applying conflict transformation in conservation, that they can be these incredibly powerful agents for change. So back to sort of how did all this, how did we start? Well, I think as human beings, we naturally tend to silo anyway. And I know, so I'll speak a little bit to the peacebuilding field. And looking back over the years when I first started engaging, like in peacebuilding conferences, and I would say that I worked on the wildlife side of things, right? Wildlife conflicts, ecological threats. I sort of got a glazed over, response, right? It was just like, what? Wait, we're dealing with genocide and civil war. Why should we care about, tigers and elephants? Similarly, on the flip side, the conservation field was really born out of being there in the wild, focusing on the biology of the animal, right? So the focus, the education, the learning, the mission, the mandate of conservation has been very non-people focused, very much animal and nature focused. So I think to some degree, the origins and the mandates, the missions, and even the capacities that have come, marched forward in these two fields have really created this division between the ecological and the human. And obviously we don't live in that world, right? We may want to try to divide off that pie and just pick off one piece of the web to focus on. But the reality is that you take any of these issues and they really are microcosms of what's going on in society. So a lot of my work, all of my work has been on the entry point has been natural resource conflicts. So wildlife conflicts, other natural resource conflicts. And what I love about wildlife conflicts is they really are an incredible entry point into addressing the societal conflicts, because the conflict over wildlife is really a microcosm of what's going on in that society. And wildlife is often a much more tangible and symbolic thing that people can grab onto, whereas it's hard to grab onto society's fragility or the conflict that's happening over there, or feelings of government overreach or distrust in government, or the tribalism that we see all around the world, and that identity conflict, that us versus them. But the wildlife can be that really tangible, physical, and symbolic manifestation of that societal conflict. So I think that's kind of how we came to that place. I think it's really important to realize also that, and again, I'll say that I think the conflict over wildlife is often, again, because it's this tangible symbolic manifestation, it is often a driver and something that people can point to as to why they don't trust government, why they don't trust science, why they don't trust the other. And so if we can use wildlife as an entry point, we can start to address a lot of these other issues like climate change that might not feel so tangible, although of course they're becoming more tangibly felt, but still. I'll give you one example of, and I'll go into more examples later on in this session. But a couple things that came to me was, one was and this gets to the why should people who are working on the front lines have conflict transformation capacity? And I'll give you an example of this. So we had a Maasai leader in a capacity building workshop that I was doing several years ago. And we met back a year later, and he reported on what he had done with this capacity and conflict transformation. And this is where I'm speaking to these people on the ground being the agents for change, and why conflict sensitivity is insufficient, and people need to be able to really transform the conflict that they're facing. So the Tanzanian government had divided up a chunk of land. Part of it was for the Maasai, and part of it was for the Hadza, which are indigenous hunter-gatherer group. And by dividing that land, what they did is divided what each indigenous people's group needed. So the Maasai couldn't migrate into the areas that they needed during certain seasons, and the Hadza couldn't hunt and gather in certain areas that they needed for seasons. So this one person, armed with conflict transformation capacity, was able to bring his community and the Hadza community together and facilitate a process, because the conflict, even though the conflict was with the government, it became a conflict between the Hadza and Maasai. So he was able to bring them together, and they figured out how to redivide the land and not divide it, but in fact share it, so that during the migration of the Maasai, they could use all aspects and all areas of the land that they needed. And when the Hadza needed to go into the Maasai land during certain seasonal patterns where they had, to do their hunting and gathering, they could go in. And so I just think that illustrates it captures the social conflict, it captures climate change and adaptability, and it captures, I think, the need for people on the ground to really have that capacity.
Thank you so much, Francine. That's really helpful grounding. And the example that you just ended with, I think, shows so poignantly the systemic nature of how these different threats, as well as opportunities to build resilience, are interconnected, because that process of conflict transformation that you talked about with the Hadza and the Maasai, finding ways to work together, manifested through the ability to share resources, and in a context where climate change is likely to create additional stress, but maybe not always predictable stress on that resource base. And neither does the process that you just described predetermine the way those resources need to be divided. It sounds like what it predetermined was a process of peaceful communication for navigating and negotiating, right? So it's really a perfect example, I think, of how different communities of practice can really benefit from thinking about these kind of underlying structural challenges that are maybe adjacent to their core focus, and finding ways to build those connections. And that's something that my friend John Furlow has been doing for a really long time. John, as a climate and science guy, spends an awful lot of time talking to people about climate science and information who are not climate science and information people, and helping them figure out what to do with that information to do their own work better. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to John for a minute. You have a very long history and background in mainstreaming climate change adaptation and response policy for USAID, which we worked on together, for foreign governments and at the State Department. And with that in mind, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your current work at IRI and how we forecast things like hotspots for the impacts of climate change, and how you're working with various audiences to help them better understand and address those impacts, maybe bridging a little bit between Michael's focus at the ETR big level and Francine's focus and how we actually work with communities who are affected by these things on the ground. Forecasting and climate science are a really important element of that. So thanks, John.
Sure, I will try. Thank you. I'll also say that somebody in the chat said that they had gone to the Fletcher School at the same time as Cynthia, and I was there, as Cynthia pointed out, I'm quite old, and so I was there a few years before Cynthia.
Hi, Michael.
So let me start by saying that in trying to communicate to people about climate change, I think some of the things that Francine said are particularly important. I think trying to think not about the abstract, but about the concrete, and understanding how might the impacts of a changing climate affect the livelihoods and the activities that people depend on, and then how might that translate into either more or less poverty, more or less food security, which could lead into human insecurity or not. Climate change is a fairly abstract concept. When you hear about what's coming out of the IPCC, people are talking about things that could happen, plus or minus some amount of uncertainty, in 80 years. It's hard to, there's not a whole lot of decisions that people have control over for themselves that are going to be affected by something that happens 80 years from now, several generations from now. But the climate system is changing, and so it manifests itself for people as weather. We don't experience averages, we experience the precise data points. And so trying to help people understand what's really happening in the frame of their own decision-making context is very helpful. And to do that, we need to find out what decisions they make, what's important to them. So in looking at the threat register and Afghanistan and Angola that were at the top, food security is one of the biggest risks. But I would want to understand, why are those two countries food insecure? Are they food insecure in the same ways, or what's contributing to it? And then some of the other things that Michael listed, water security, population growth, extreme events, extreme temperatures, contribute to food insecurity. As Michael said, growing population means if you have a static amount of food, you're sharing it among more people. So it undermines the ability to feed everyone. So I think thinking in terms of causes and effects, inputs and outcomes is also important. And climate, or the way that we feel the weather on a given day, is one input among many. And so helping people understand for themselves, is my problem driven by the way the climate is behaving, or am I having a food security problem because I can't get to the market? And why can't I? Or because there is nothing in the market? Am I depending on my own resources, or am I depending, people who live in cities depend on someone else to provide them with food. So understanding how you're vulnerable to climate risks is very important. And I think helping people think about it in terms of when they are at risk. And again, most of us are not at risk from something that's going to happen 80 years from now. We're at risk of changes that are already built into the system that are going to manifest themselves over the next few days, the next season. At IRI, where we work, we focus on seasonal forecasting. And we do that because we find that that's very helpful for supporting decision-making in things like agriculture and public health, energy system management, because you can look out a few months into the future and say, this is going to be wetter than normal, or hotter than normal, or drier than normal, and then begin working with communities and practitioners who know what they've done in the past when it's gotten too wet or too dry or too hot or too cold. And then they can kick into action the things they've done in the past and try to apply the experiences they've had in the past to the conditions that they are likely to face in the next few months. So thinking about that, then the way that we like to work here is to go into either at the national level, if we're working with a, say a National Ministry of Agriculture, or at the community level, and really break down, get partners that we work with to break down what they're trying to accomplish, the resources and the practices and systems they have in place to accomplish those things, and then understand where do you get kind of knocked off your path? What prevents you from achieving what you intended to? And if it's weather related, then we talk to them about what kind of a forecast might be useful to them. And is it a forecast that they need, or is it just monitoring information of what's happening in real time, or is it just better historical data? And then we can bring those resources to bear. And the way that IRI tries to work is through a capacity building approach. We don't provide data. We train weather departments in different countries to produce forecasts for themselves. And then we try to build working relationships between the groups that need to use the information and the people who are producing it, so that you get a functional kind of a supply and demand, or demand and supply relationship going, so that the agriculture ministry can say, meteorological department, I do not understand that bulletin that you put out every month. It just doesn't make sense, so I don't read it. Well, then that probably rich information has no value because nobody's putting it to work for a better outcome. So then we try to understand what's inscrutable in that weather bulletin, and update it and add information that may be more relevant to the decision makers or the people who are supporting them. We try to work within the systems that are in place so that we can alleviate well, we don't work on population growth, but all of the other issues that Michael named that contribute to instability or risk, food security, water, extreme events, and temperatures, are things that can either be directly forecast on a seasonal time scale, or can be combined. If you understand what's driving the food insecurity, there's a good chance that there's a weather variable behind it, and that's what can be forecast. So then the Agricultural Extension Service can work with farmers to say, we think it's going to be dry, let's work with these drought tolerant seeds. We think it's going to be wet, we're going to have a good year, let's invest in more inputs so that you get as good a crop as you can. Might even bring in the financial side of things to introduce index insurance, insurance products for smallholder farmers, so that if they lose everything on the farm, they don't have to dig into their savings or their other assets to pay off someone who made them a loan. So I'll try to wrap up. I think if we can break down the decision-making that's driving systems at either the national or the local level, then we can begin to be informed by those decision makers what information would be useful. And then we can get to work on introducing some kind of forecast or data that could inform those decisions.
John, that was so rich. I took about 700 notes. And picking up on your very last point, what information would be useful? That is a great question. There was a question that came in from the audience, Silas Akisa, a little while ago that I think picks up on that. His question was, what you just spent a lot of time talking about, ecological threats vary a lot at the local level. So saying food insecurity might look really different in its manifestation, and the causes of that manifestation at the community level, let alone the sort of sub-regional level within countries. So that's a really key question. And what his follow-on question was, so how do we address that? Do you start bottom up, top down? And I think your point, what information do you need to know to make the better decision, is really important. And that brings me right back to the ETR, which is frankly a great tool. especially at the global level, especially for sort of raising red flags to get folks who then need to do the more local level context analysis to know what to pay attention to. And so, Michael, I wanted to ask you this question. Finding the connection between early warning for risks and then motivating the responses is always a really tough one, not least because of all the variables that John just spent some time discussing. But knowing that the ETR is a great tool, in your view, what are the best ways that the new index could be used to help bridge this divide between having global level information and needing local level evidence for action?
Sure, absolutely.
Small question, I know.
You know, well, one of the things that we hope the ecological threat register is good at is being able to kind of sort of pinpoint essentially or prioritize the countries that are most vulnerable, and therefore where action is required, the quickest or immediately, or where investments are required, or where local solutions should be developed. So that that's kind of one sort of added value that we hope that the ETR can produce. But the other thing is that it also just kind of sort of really reinforces this aspect of, with breaking that to break that cycle, not only do we obviously require things like, reducing emissions at a global level, but also improving, ecological resource management and socioeconomic resilience more broadly. That's not necessarily an innovative idea, but it is certainly something that, we are able to break down in a lot more detail and provide sort of more actionable insights for. At the end of last year's ETR, which was our first ETR, we were able to get together 60 different policy experts to be able to sort of talk about the potential policy implications of the information that the ETR shared. And there's a whole list of these, kind of sort of policy recommendations at the end of the report. And, perhaps basing it on the last question, what I'll do is kind of sort of highlight 3 of those. One of the first things that came out from the group, and also comes out from our research, is this sort of need to explore more integrated structures, more constructed around systems. And Francine touched upon this also, and I know that we're all very tired of the word silo at this point. But being able to kind of sort of create agencies that, beyond the sort of the paperwork or their supposed position, are truly able to integrate a variety of different things that lead to these higher levels of socioeconomic social resilience, right? So integrate food security, but also integrate water, also integrate governance, also integrate refugee support or family planning for that matter, and being able to essentially work on all of these components at the same time, having full view of all of these, because the interplay with all of these things, as John noted, is where the magic, but where the disasters happen, right? So having a very clear idea of what is improving in one end, what is deteriorating in another is key. And that includes, for example, things like better coordination between the military and development as well, especially if we think of sort of the definition of military as ensuring a safe and secure environment in which sort of civilian activity can prosper. One of the other things that kind of sort of really came up, and this also touches on what Francine was saying, is that this this amplifying sort of solutions to ecological problems that help generate income specifically, right? And one of the problems that we have in terms of financing is that the scope of the problem is well beyond the budget of all of the international agencies combined, and the sum of the national government's income is sort of 15% of the world's GDP. So there's an 85% that isn't being leveraged. Some of that is tied up in the world's global pension funds, that we can definitely find ways of kind of sort of making the case for why investment specifically in these hotspot countries would be in their long-term interest. But one of the areas that we think is extremely underutilized to date is the leveraging of local entrepreneurship. And when we looked into some of the numbers specifically, you have these high-level multilateral financing, the World Banks, and that come in at the country level and investing, $5 million up to $200-300 million per country. And then we have all of these kind of sort of micro loan components, but we feel that there's a distinct gap between sort of the $5,000 and the $50,000 mark for seed capital for local firms, local businesses, and local initiatives, specifically related to food security and agriculture. So that's a gap, but it's also an opportunity, right, in some ways. And then in terms of sort of the third solution or third recommendation arising from the conversations is also perhaps not necessarily a surprise, is the need for community-led approaches, right? And this is something that's been sort of acknowledged, it's talked about, but even today is still very, very rarely done. Now, invariably, communities, they have a better understanding of what the needs are, they're better able to leverage strengths, and invariably, these projects end up with, being a lot less expensive. So in terms of kind of sort of three specific examples, I suppose you could say, one of the things, and there's a number of these in the report, but there's one related specifically to the success of FMNR in southern Niger, which has taken off greatly since the 60s, and basically, so it's farmer managed natural regeneration. A number of you will be a lot more familiar with it than I am, but essentially it consists of sort of sprouting from felled stumps. And that's led to sort of the regeneration of 5 million hectares in what some people have kind of sort of called the largest regreening in human history. Now, southern Niger is actually greener than Nigeria, even though it has less rainfall. And that concept, that idea is now being expanded upon by many different organizations and in many different countries. Another one specifically included in the report is sort of the expansion of permaculture practices, for example, used in or previously used in very small sort of very small villages or communities in Honduras, which has been expanded with support from multilateral organizations or agencies such as FAO, for example, and has now in Honduras reached over 5,000 farmers, which has enabled them to sort of double their yields and also create crops that are more resistant to climate shocks as well. Just one last example, specifically in terms of sort of very small entrepreneurial initiatives, the construction of sand dams, which is something that the Charitable Foundation, which is IEP's sister organization, is involved with in Tanzania, that are able to return or give an ROI sort of 3 times above what the investment cost was. And then just to sort of touch on the financial component that I sort of talked about before, one of the things that we see is that the cooperative revolving funds are also a very good structure that has had a lot of success in a lot of different countries that can be sort of that can be supportive of any one of these initiatives, whether it's a food security initiative, whether it's related to drilling or conserving water in some other way. As a tool, for kind of sort of financing this and creating systems in which it's actually the entrepreneurs themselves who then, return the loans and continue that investment over time. And, there's one specific kind of sort of opportunity there was actually one stat when I was doing, when I was kind of sort of preparing some of the points, and let me just bring it up and make sure I get it right. Okay. So in the Republic of the Congo, right, this is one of the hotspot countries. 40% of the population is engaged in agriculture, and only 5% of it, 5% of the arable land is cultivated. Now you can see that as kind of sort of a disaster, which it is, but you can also see it as a tremendous opportunity for being able to land in that entrepreneurial area there and to find new ways of generating food security at the local level. And lastly, I'd like to end on positive peace, as we sort of always do. The positive peace component of IEP's work really sort of provides national governments to be able to develop a systems map of all of the areas related to social resilience, and therefore more resilience to all forms of crisis, whether that be future natural disasters or food insecurity or things like COVID-19, for example. And those same principles are applicable at the community level as well in the same way. Just to kind of sort of end with a stat related to that, 89% of countries with low or very low ETR scores have high positive peace scores. And there's no country with a high positive peace score that has a very poor ETR score. So that really kind of sort of underscores the importance of focusing definitely on conflict sensitivity, but also this underlying social resilience through positive peace.
Wow, thanks, Michael. There was a lot embedded in that conversation, not least is, so I'm reading some of the chat questions along the way too. I mean, not least just that the ETR itself, I think, does a real service in helping to give a common narrative across these different kind of issue areas. And as you just said in your remarks, a lot of different ways, there's so much adaptive capacity that is already built in if you give people the tools to strengthen it or utilize it. You gave a lot of different kind of programming examples where that was true, but the outcome is that you have stronger resilience against these various different stresses and threats to the stability of those systems, whether it's livelihood or food security, et cetera. And I think those words around adaptive capacity and resilience clearly sometimes mean slightly different things to different communities of practice. So defining them in something like the ETR and creating this sort of shared narrative to move within is really helpful. I also wanted to pick up on something you said about, for example, financial mechanisms and the type of funding that can be applied and that can be useful to entrepreneurs, for example. That so obviously doesn't have to exist within only one purpose. It doesn't have to be utilized only for peace building or only for fostering social cohesion or only for helping farmers get things to market, right? Those are the types of tools that I think are helpful in this conversation for all of us to kind of be thinking about how those things can be applied in our own spaces at the local level. That's really great. And so that brings me back to Francine, who's worked with a lot of different actors who are often coming from different viewpoints, but your whole goal is to always bring them together around their shared interests. And yet there are critical gaps between conservation and conflict prevention actors in trying to address kind of like something shared, like a climate and insecurity challenge at the local level. And I wanted to draw on two questions from the audience related to those gaps. Let me just see if I can find it. Sorry, guys, bear with me for 1 second. Right, so Casey Harrison asked about translating systems complexities in local communities for actionable change. And he asked, what are key actors, change agents in a given community? And that made me think, Francine, about your work in trying to get over some of these gaps, some of these like differences in narrative or language or perceived differences in goals. Where do you see that those gaps are kind of the biggest in your own work? And where have you found the real levers for change? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think the relationship between the gaps and the levers for change are very interrelated because the levers, as we know, are often nonlinear and they're counterintuitive. So what we might want to achieve, right? And I see some of the questions include like, well, what do we do about digital transformation? What do we do about energy? And what do we do about these other things? And I think part of this is where's your entry point in here? What is the thing that's kind of bubbling up for that segment of society or that system or subsystem? And using the energy around that as an entry point, but then expanding that pie so that you're including these other interrelated, interconnected problems, right? So that you are designing a process that's looking at the whole rather than at just the one thing that you care about, right? So I think the best way, I'm going to share some examples. I also saw someone asking for other examples from different places around the world. So I'll just throw out a few. So one, an intervention I did in the Galapagos. I was brought in because an organization had been trying to get ecological restoration for biodiversity and climate change. They weren't getting anywhere with it for 15 years. when I went in and designed this in a more inclusive way, more expansive way, it included, education, infrastructure, water security, livelihoods, a whole bunch of different things that together, you got the conservation and the sustainable development, right? So you got the livelihood, you've got the conservation, you've got climate change, you've got, education for girls, you name it, the whole thing. And then the whole package, the entire island community, the 5 ministries that were involved, the 2 NGOs that were involved, could embrace, they supported the entire package. And that was, they're continuing along in implementation. And this has now been 7 or 8 years later. But the important thing is it's not going in there and say, how do we address this problem? It's using that issue, the ecological restoration, as a way to address a whole bunch of different social and environmental problems within that context. Another case in northern Mozambique, it was, they were trying to address a lot of wildlife, lion, elephant, et cetera, conservation issues. But once this team of conservation actors went through our capacity building in conflict transformation and started applying that, and they were motivated because there had been a timber extraction entity that had come in the area, and then the addition of that actor in the system actually exponentially, or just it exploded the wildlife trafficking, poaching and wildlife trafficking of elephants for the ivory trade. So now this was outside the realm of what they could handle, right? Or so they thought. So they came in, they then had their capacity built in conflict transformation. They went back out, went to these communities that were in this conservancy that they're working in. And so here's your counterintuitive leverage. And this is just one example. There's a whole bunch of other things going on, but I'm going to simplify it a little bit for the sake of time. They had environmental funding, conservation funding for education, but they went to the community and said, what do you want education in? And they said construction. And the conservation group was like, oh, okay, sure. What do you want to construct? And they were like, a mosque. And they were like, okay, we don't know how we're going to explain this to our American funders, but go for it. So they did. They built this mosque, which secured and legitimized their identity, which then they started fighting against poaching. And wildlife trafficking and poaching in this conservancy dropped. I mean, it just plummeted. What that then did is that changed the nature, reconciled their relationship. They thought they had a good partnership before, but until they really saw what a good partnership was. And then that in turn created the space, the opportunity, and the receptivity to now start changing agriculture, because this is an extremely drought-prone area, getting worse because of climate change, that they could now do conservation agriculture, and the local community owned it. They took it on, they owned it, they spread it. So now they would have food security. So this shows, I think, a little bit of the linkages and recognizing that some of the entry points might not be what we think they are, but by keeping sort of a wide frame on what needs to happen, all these other elements can be included. So it's not it has to be this, or how do you address this one thing? If you're taking a different approach and bringing in these different actors, the government, the community, the conservation actors, whoever it might be, then there's no reason you can't address all of those elements. The final example I'll give you is in the US. This was an intervention that I did on the wolf conflict in the US. The wolf conflict is kind of the Middle East of wildlife conflicts. So this brought together government, citizen, rural, urban, liberal, conservative, you name that political, or you name that division, and it's there. And they took this through this conflict transformation process. They decided, and they created as a mission, that they were going to use their addressing the wolf conflict as a way to heal and bridge the divide between liberal, conservative, urban, rural, et cetera. It was definitely a system engagement, right? So what we're looking for is to create this kind of positive social contagion or positive ripple effect. So even though they were developing policies and decisions around the wolf conflict, this also led to elected officials who couldn't work together for decades being able to come together on climate change, on wildfire prevention. It led to Republican, Democratic bills in their legislature that passed on preventing domestic animal abuse. It led to gender equity and workplace safety and a whole bunch of other social and environmental components to this. The other thing that was really cool about this is that intervention ended over 3 years ago when the January 6th events were happening at the US Capitol. I was getting all these texts from, I haven't seen these people in 3+ years. All these texts are like, hey, because I live in DC, they're like, are you okay? Blah, blah, blah. Turns out they were having a multi-stakeholder meeting, government and citizen and all the different folks, some who had voted for Trump, some who had voted for Biden. The room was probably a little bit split on that. And what one of the government conveners, what they were meeting at the exact time that the January 6 events were going on. And he said, hey, this is a really big deal, right? Because everybody's phones are kind of blowing up with this news. He said, should we reconvene at another time? And one of the members of this diverse group said, no, what we're doing here is the antidote to what's happening in the Capitol right now. So let's keep working on adapting this policy. And every single person in that meeting said, yep, let's keep going. And they kept plowing forward to still keep working together, bridging that divide and working on concrete solutions together. So there.
I think we are all going to hold on to your amazing quote of the wolf issue being equivalent to the Middle East intractable conflict. Good analogy. Thank you for all of those really specific examples. I think that helps all of us kind of ground the context of these sometimes larger words, even like climate change. What does that actually look like to a population of gray wolves and their management and their habitat, et cetera? Really, really helpful. You said capacity building a lot of times during that conversation, and that's actually something John talks about a lot as well in his work. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to pick up on that and follow up with 2 questions that are related. So the first is about, Francine, as you were talking about kind of coalition building, sometimes between groups of people who hadn't formally been aligned, there is so much strength in that aligned vision on the other side. And if you're talking about something like conservation of a particular resource or a particular animal, one can easily imagine how that goal actually stands in contrast or opposition to other goals or other objectives. And I am, as a peace building and conflict person, always reminded of one of the early lessons I learned about capacity building, where we from the outside often come in with the goal of elevating subjugated or marginalized voices. And we spend a lot of time awareness raising, empowering, enabling, but in a place affected by fragility and conflict in governance systems, you have to also take equal time to build the capacity of those systems to respond to the new elevated voice or need, or otherwise you're fomenting additional challenges. And one of our questions came in about where you might accidentally, for example, create a future ecological threat, or in my parlance, I would say any kind of threat that you kind of just hadn't anticipated by building a strength. And so my example is certainly about where we empower sort of one part of the equation without remembering to empower the response part of the equation. And for me, that related to your experience and examples of where you might actually build a really strong coalition and voice that then may not have a responsive governance environment to work with. So one question is kind of just to reflect, I mean, all 3 of you for sure, certainly I know John and Francine have a lot of practical experience working on those kind of dynamics. And I wonder what you would say about that. Maybe if you have examples of where you ran into that and then course corrected, how do you do that? Or if you thought about it from the outset, what can you do? And then another question from the audience that I think relates to this is, in that process of thinking about capacity building, how do you do it in a way that overcomes some of the natural vulnerabilities in the system, leaving out excluded voices or more marginalized populations? And I think, again, for me, that means everything from remembering that if women are responsible for childcare, they can't attend a meeting during non-school hours, or right, where people have different roles and responsibilities in their families or in their communities. They can not always be physically available for things. And then obviously there is the context of different identities being treated differently in these processes. So maybe try to, if you could draw that on that too. I think that it would be very interesting to hear about that capacity building process and maybe your experience of where you avoid an unintended additional risk if it hasn't been done, sort of both sides of the equation. And then also maybe where you have those examples of having brought in different groups of people who would otherwise not have made it to the table in the capacity building process. So maybe, John, can I turn it over to you first? Do you have any thoughts about all that?
Well, I hope so. So one of the things that, so to kind of restate what I think you're saying, there's a risk when you introduce solutions to favoring one group or another and exacerbating some sort of conflict or unrest. And this can happen at a variety of scales. I've seen it a lot within governments where the meteorological department is usually one of the weaker agencies in a government, and yet they produce really valuable information. And the more powerful institutions in the government tend to be the agriculture ministry, if it's a country that depends a lot on agriculture, finance ministry, maybe the foreign ministry. So we always try to enable people to understand that the agriculture ministry may be really powerful, but it depends on, or it ought to depend on, the meteorological service for useful information, and then it depends on the success of farmers. So if the minister and the staff in the ag ministry have goals for themselves, if we can understand what it is that they define as success for themselves, how are they going to get promoted or rewarded for doing a good job? And then we can help them see that that success really depends on these other groups that may seem weak, but that they depend on. And then we can get them thinking about how they might support them. And so that may strengthen the link from the agriculture ministry down through the extension service to the farm level, to the community level. And it may strengthen the budget and the support, the resources in a finite budget in a small country. There are these questions of, well, do we give money to the ag ministry or the Met Department? We don't understand what the Met Department does, so let's not give them more money. But once the agriculture ministry understands that they can achieve their SDG goals, their national development goals, their et cetera, better if they get a little bit of support from the ag ministry, then they may start collaborating. And then if you can understand that really the agriculture ministry is not actually growing anything, that's all happening at the farm level. So you want to make sure that success is flowing all the way down to there. You may be able to start, I don't know, I like to get people to understand these dependencies and that one person's success depends on another's. So you want to not compete, but build everybody up to the extent that you can. So I'll stop there and see what Francine has to say.
I like the way you just said that, John. It's not to compete, it's to build everybody up. And as I was listening to what Cynthia was saying, and sort of the questions that she was asking us to grapple with, and I was thinking about, so when we're building capacity in conflict transformation, it's done in such a way that I mean, the reality is in these conflicts, everybody feels marginalized, everybody feels left out to some extent, everybody feels, even if they're an in-power group or an out-of-power group, people are either afraid of losing power or they feel that they don't have power. And so when I sort of reflect on our methodology and how we do that, it isn't about favoring one group over the other. It's recognizing that every individual and every group has a need to have their identity be secured, to have meaningful say in decisions that affect them, that want the recognition and that sense of belonging. So those, Burton's sort of basic human needs, they apply to everybody. And then if you can create the space for people to talk about how those needs haven't been met, right? How people have felt marginalized or empowered. It's not about lifting one group up over another. It's recognizing and having them understand what the sacred values are for each side, having them understand how they felt that their needs haven't been met. And in fact, the power of that, that when I've done this with groups where there's seemingly a large disparity of power between individuals, between groups, is that they recognize that at that basic level, they actually are, they're grappling with the same feelings of a lack of recognition, of feeling like their identity is constantly under attack. And so it actually creates common ground for them to be able to work and solve each other's problems. So again, just echoing what John said, it's not a competition. It's sort of that, rising tide raises all boats, and recognizing that every boat has its own story, right? Every individual and every group has its own story. I'm looking at I don't know if I want to just jump in here.
Well, is it the last question that was addressed to you? Can I say there were two questions that came in right in a row that bring up gender? So why don't we pick those up? And the first one from Mark Clark, it was interesting to see gender disaggregated perspectives on climate in the ETR. And he asks, is there a slide also perhaps, on generational differences and the perspectives of younger versus older? So that's probably to Michael. And then the related one on gender from Timothy, for maybe Francine and John, does gender have a role towards building an adaptive cycle around climate change? I know you've both worked on gender issues within climate space, so maybe you'd like to comment on that. Michael, should we start with you and the question from Mark?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So yes, gender is disaggregated for the perceptions of climate in the ecological threat report, and we do see on average that males ever so slightly actually sort of report a higher level of concern than females, although that does vary greatly around the world. In Europe, for example, the female population is significantly, the percentage is significantly higher. In other places, it's a lot lower, and it kind of sort of varies between 10 and 15% around the world, depending. So it is actually disaggregated by age, because I know of questions that are asked in parallel to that one that have been disaggregated in age. I don't think that we have any slides, and I don't think that it is directly included in the ecological threat register, although I'd be very happy to share that information, because we do have that in the background. One of the things that I did want to touch on quickly, which relates to both age and gender, is one of the things that we saw when looking into food security was that the average levels of male thinness, right, and particularly stunting in countries with low levels of peace was significantly higher, sometimes twice as higher as levels of female stunting. And we don't really have any answers to that, other than to say that there is actually a dearth of research in this particular area, right? Specifically, male access to food or undernutrition in males. And connections with conflict. I mean, a couple of kind of sort of things that come to mind are things like, and the reason I say age is because actually this discrepancy was the largest between the age of 5 and 19. So essentially those development years. And, I mean, you have to kind of sort of think about how undernourishment, affects potentially emotional control, and how that can lead to increased conflicts because of the connection that we see in countries with low levels of peace, or alternatively, things like how hunger can be a cause of young males joining malicious or terrorist groups, for example. So definitely, a lot of interesting things to explore in that particular area, and we feel that there's a niche and a gap and a need to know more.
Thanks, Michael. Francine, do you want to jump in next?
Sure. There's so much to say around this, but I guess one thing that I so gender is important, right? Diversity, as we know, is critical for more sophisticated, more lasting solutions, right? And so, so gender is one element of that diversity. When you think about the role of gender, the examples that keep coming to mind are where I or others, through a process that feels safe and people have had their capacity built as part of that intervention, and as part of that process, that actually can address some of those issues through humor. And I'm thinking of the very first intervention I ever did, which was almost 30 years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago, I can't remember. I was working in an East African country where the women were only allowed to be in the very back of the room and sitting in the back. And so, and all the men were up front, and on the benches, the women were sitting in the back. And I just playfully was just like, oh, guys, I'm kind of lonely up here as the only woman. 300 of you. Can we bring some of the women to the front just so I don't feel so lonely? And it was fun. Everybody laughed and all the women came to the front. Boom, right? Just shifting those dynamics. I can think of another one in the US where there were groups of people who sort of kept acknowledging only the men in the room. And so finally it got to this point where some of the women could say, well, hey, you know what, then don't call us because we're a woman. And it was just playful, and everybody laughed. And after that, they were acknowledged and drawn out in that room. And so I don't know if this quite answers the question, but I guess I do want to say that I think I see this in maybe it's in peacebuilding, but I definitely know it's in conservation. I'd say it's in both. The stakes are really high. It's just really scary. And sometimes we don't have to address things in this white knuckled grip way, but we can be a little bit softer, a little bit more playful around it. And the other thing that I'm aware of, probably in this group, but it's certainly in the two larger groups of sort of peacebuilding and sort of climate change conservation, is and all of this issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is really critical. And I'm going to speak to a US and maybe a European context here, is that we're missing ideological diversity. So that after the wolf conflict, after that intervention ended, I started getting calls all across the country from conservatives, liberals, landowners, government, conservationists, et cetera, saying, hey, how do we scale this up? How do we scale this up so we can work across the American West? And we applied for funding to do this, to do something at this much larger scale. And it had a very strong diversity, equity, and inclusion component, but ideological, political diversity didn't count. That absolutely didn't count. And to me, it says there's a problem here that we're not, and it gets back to somebody's point about, but maybe it was yours, Cynthia, about the fact that if you're lifting one group up, you're pushing one group down, and that just doesn't work, right? So we have to recognize that those perceptions, that each group's perception, whether they come from power or they come from no power, that their perceptions are valid, and we have to respond to that and be inclusive of all of that.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Yeah, and John, I'm going to turn to you in just a second. This question about in what way does gender have a role in building adaptive capacity to climate change? And Francine, your very last point about being mindful that as we empower certain groups, while it may not be objectively disempowering to another group, the perception of the balance of power in general can shift. And I think gender is a really important component of that, being mindful of the socially constructed roles and identities of men and women and boys and girls, being very careful not to conflate the word gender with women, and really thinking through as you think about the physical impacts from climate change hitting a social construct. Maybe, John, you could just share an example of where you've seen gender dimensions of the challenges or the responses?
Sure. Probably 8 or 10 years ago, while I was still at AID, we decided to try to understand better how we started with a gender perspective on how do people access information and use it in farming. We were looking mostly in Mali, in West Africa, and we realized that it wasn't necessarily the access to information that was the problem, it was the access to resources to act on the information. So sure, in a village where where weather information was getting out to people via the radio, and then following the weather information advisories from the agriculture ministry and other groups, in general, men controlled the radio. But in a small community, everybody can hear the radio. So the information, I think, was getting out fairly even-handedly. The problem that we found was that with basically limited access to tools, the men got the tools first, and they might, take the forecast and decide that they were going to go weed and prepare the seeds. And it was only when they were done that women could do that. So even very good information delivered in a timely fashion should be useful. It wasn't useful to people who didn't have the resources to respond. And so, and then we also found, along the lines that Michael was pointing about the stunting, that there was a gender line, but there was also an age line and a seniority line. So older men had first access to the tools, the shovels, the hose, whatever, and then women, and then younger men, and then younger women. And so it was a multi-dimensional sort of hierarchy that was affecting things. So a lesson for me, for AID, was, again, we need to break down and really understand the decisions that people were making and the ability they have to make those decisions differently based on better information. If they're locked into a one way of doing things, putting a lot of effort into giving better information for planning may not really help anything. And then I just wanted to very quickly say something about the farmer managed natural regeneration, which was something that AID was involved with for a long time. One of the places where that had a benefit, I think it got started in Niger. And one of the things that we saw was that women would be given access to a degraded piece of land. They could sort of revitalize it by letting trees and shrubs grow back up. But then once the land was better, men wanted it back. And so then you got into, it started with shifts in policy from the way the forestry department in Niger handled who owned the trees and who had the right to use them for different reasons, which sort of freed up the allowing of these trees to come back. But then after they had the positive benefit, we had to go back and worry about would the resource be taken away from women after they had revitalized it. And in the cases that I heard of, what I heard was that the courts, whether they were secular or religious, said no, the women added value. They get to keep farming it, but it's something to keep an eye on.
Some examples really help us understand the dimensions that we have to work around and within and towards. So we are at the end of our time together. I want to thank all of the panelists for speaking so openly and so articulately about really complex issues. I can tell from the amazing engagement of our audience that lots of people were inspired by the conversation, and thank you to everyone who was providing your comments and feedback throughout the conversation. I think it really enriched all of this discussion, so thank you. And before we sign off, I just wanted to also say thank you to Liz and to Nick behind the scenes for making this all possible. AFP is amazing. And I know that all of us, the four of us looking at you now, are really grateful to them for bringing this conversation together and putting all of these examples and discussions out into the world and reaching so many additional people. Thank you. I wanted to give the panelists one final closing thought. This was an hour and a half of conversation, and I am imagining people wrote down a whole bunch of stuff. If you could have everyone walk away with just one takeaway, what is it? What do each of you want everyone to remember from the conversation today? One little seed of a thought. And I'm going to go to Michael first.
So, thanks, Cynthia. So I'd say that the systemic component, right, which we kind of sort of, I think we all really kind of sort of touched upon in different ways, the EDR through the various kind of degrees of research at various levels, the wonderful example that Francine shared about the building of the mosque. That's actually kind of sort of my main take home for the day is this systemic nature and the need of anyone, whether working extremely locally or whether working, at a national government or for a large civil society organization, to think about these components systemically, to be able to kind of sort of, create projects and initiatives that build on each other in a way that strengthens resilience overall. And because these levels of resilience to ecological threats come from so many different perspectives, it also means that everybody can contribute independently of your level of expertise or your area of focus. It's just a question of placing yourself where you are on that map and going from there.
Thanks, Michael. Francine, key takeaway.
Key takeaway would be, because of the systemic nature of everything that we're dealing with, I think that the capacity to address conflict, to transform conflict, needs to be threaded through all of these different silos. I think that will actually create this, us being able to work across silos. So I would say both the capacity, I think governments have an extremely strong role to play in this, and funders have a really strong role, is that for them to get out of this box of silos and recognize that they may not have the answers, but by engaging in a conflict transformation way, that they can trust that that process is going to lead to addressing all of these different challenges, or what the challenges are that these communities and these different groups need to address.
Thank you. So more money for conflict transformation. Thank you. John, key takeaway.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really glad that Michael and Francine answered that first. Thanks to both of you. That was good. I just, along the lines of what they said, these are not unidimensional problems. And so I think, again, looking across the silos that Francine mentioned, and in governments and in funding agencies, thinking about how these things are connected, that there's a continuity from conflict and human insecurity up through development, and all of the investments and the efforts and the successes that we have on the development end of the spectrum, if they don't work, if we're not investing wisely, they may cause more problems on the disaster or conflict end of the spectrum. And so, again, let's not think of this as a competition for resources, but a way of achieving the outcomes that we all want through whatever is the most effective or efficient means to get there. And if it's not in my budget, it's in Francine's, that's fine. So that's what I would say.
Fantastic final insights. Thank you to everyone at your computers, desks, iPhones for participating in today's conversation. And I express deep appreciation to John, Michael, Francine for allowing me to be a part of this conversation and tap into all your amazing insights. So good luck.